Elizabeth Becker. Here's what I'd like to say at the outset about Elizabeth. She's proof that we do live in a just world, at least sometimes. And what I mean by that is this. Elizabeth, as a journalist, for a number of years did some hard time on some hard stories. She began her career as a war reporter in Cambodia in the early 1970s and ended up writing a very revealing book about the Khmer Rouge when the war was over. She worked as a Washington Post correspondent, then the senior foreign editor at NPR, then a New York Times reporter covering the Pentagon, Homeland Security, international economics, and agriculture, all pretty heavy subjects. So after her hard time on these hard stories, it was only just that Elizabeth was able to go research a book on a, well, seemingly at least, fun and enjoyable subject, namely the tourism industry. And indeed, as she recounts in Overbooked, the exploding business of travel and tourism, she had some great adventures over the 5 years she worked on the book. Snorkeling in Costa Rica, meeting with hotel operators and investors in Sri Lanka, going on safari in Zambia. Boy, I'm beginning to feel like I wish I were traveling somewhere. Visiting wine cellars in Bordeaux, interviewing Chinese tour guides. But Elizabeth, being the unceasing journalist that she is, wasn't interested simply in writing a travel log. In fact, her concern, as she says in the introduction of Overbooked, was that the travel business had not received the kind of tough scrutiny of some other major industries, such as energy, finance, or agriculture. Indeed, she notes, journalists have tended to give travel a pass. And yet tourism over the past few decades has grown into an enormous economic sector. Just consider the number of foreign trips in a given year, which has surged from 25 million in 1960 to 1 billion last year. All this business certainly has meant jobs, cultural enrichment, and sheer enjoyment for many travelers. But there's also been a significant dark side, which Elizabeth chronicles and we'll be talking about in a minute. After reading Overbooked, you'll be much smarter the next time you plan a trip, and also much more aware of what everyone else's travel is doing to the sociology, ecology, politics, and economics of our planet. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Becker.
Well, that's the best introduction. That's almost my book. Thank you, Brad, a former colleague. Thank you all for coming. As Brad sort of suggested, when I told people what I was doing, they looked at me like, huh? Have you decided to really retire? And I want to first explain how and why I came to write this book. My last beat at the New York Times was international economics. And this was at the beginning of the 21st century. And every time I was doing one of these important topics, be it trade or agriculture, I kept running into the tourism industry. And if you read any of our wonderful newspapers in the United States, there's travel sections, but there's nothing about the tourism industry. And when I tried to talk the New York Times into it, I got nowhere. And I think I've reached the point where I knew something was happening when I did an interview in Paris with the number 2 at the Agriculture Ministry. And at the end of the interview, I said, why do you have these maps behind you? One was a map of the trains of France, another of the arable land, that made sense. And the third was the cultural festivals of France. I said, I think I understand the trains, I know what the land means, but why do you have a map of the cultural festivals behind you? He said, oh, because it all feeds into tourism, and that's our most important industry. Why were we not covering it? So here we are, 5 years later. The figures that Brad mentioned, I think they especially explode once the Cold War ends, and that's sort of where I begin this book. In hindsight, it makes all the sense in the world, but I felt like a eureka moment when I noticed that, aha, the figures jump when the Cold War ends and all the borders are open. And of course, travel and tourism has to be the one industry that obviously and simply took the best advantage of the end of the Cold War. By the time all the borders were open in 1995, there were 536 million foreign trips. And then by last year, 2012, it was 1 billion. That's huge. And that's just 1 billion trips across foreign borders. That does not count the travel you take within your own country. And the United Nations World Tourism Organization, which few of you have ever heard of, it's, I think, the only underfinanced UN agency I've ever seen. They estimate that if you add domestic trips, you might triple that figure to 3 billion. That's a lot of travel. That's a lot of money. And that's the other figure that I still can't wrap my head around. $6.4 trillion with a T, trillion dollars in business last year, added to the trillion with a T, 6.4 trillion. Now, we as Americans don't think of travel and tourism as an industry as much as we would anything else. And one of the reasons we don't have a Ministry of Tourism to speak of, we have a small tourism agency within the Commerce Department, and until recently, we were not measuring it. It took nearly a decade of the UN and the industry to come up with something called a satellite count so that you could even measure this. And this is where this is all coming about at the same time. Then, as we get the bamboo curtain, the iron curtain, whatever you want to use, falling, you learn how to measure the amount of money. Then you have the great technological leaps. The internet, we all know what that has done to booking and travel. You think with 1 click, 2 clicks, you can go halfway across the world. And then finally, the leaps in transportation, so that now you can take an airplane, a single flight halfway across the globe. That's relatively new. And all this adds up to the statistics that we were just mentioning. And in terms of jobs, it is now between 1 out of 12 people and 1 out of 11 people in the world who are employed by this sector. Huge. So it's fun to talk about this, but then the dark side. If tourism were a country, the industry thinks it would be the 5th biggest polluter in the world. And that's sort of what I want to start talking about. When I started the book, also people thought the only thing I wanted to talk about would be the environment. And so that is part of it. But the way I structured it was to talk about the reasons we travel: cultural, consumer, nature, and then the giants who are the engines behind this. And in the culture, I used 2 examples of using tourism for the betterment of society and economy and sociology, and not. And the betterment is a country that surprised me, and that's France. France is the most attractive country in the world now for tourism. It's smaller than Texas. It receives more foreign tourists than we do. I had no idea. And the way people know France and the way people know the world now is more as tourists than anything else. Just before I came here, I did a little survey of your store, Brad. You have 74 different books about France in your tourism section, your travel literature. Over there in your world history section, you have 10. And then in your perennial readers, you have 2. And they're both about Paris, and they're both about travel. So that's, whether you admit it or not, most of us know the world now is tourists. And France figured this out before just about any other country. Not surprisingly, they invented what we know as a tourism industry. When the Dottie English were crossing the channel on their way to Rome and Greece, they stopped in France, and the French said, aha, how can we take advantage of this? And they started their industry. And then part of their socialism in the 30s, between the 2 wars, they also instituted the first paid vacations in the world. That's Léon Blum. The very first were French. Would you believe that? Then, so you have the French welcoming tourists and becoming tourists themselves. Very nice industry going until World War II. And at the end of World War II, when France was eligible for the money under the Marshall Plan, the United States and France got together and decided the best way to resurrect the economy was through the Marshall Plan, through tourism. So we helped build tourism in France. Then they had their Ministry of Culture, which feeds into it, so on and so forth, so that now France receives the most, and everything about their government will build around tourism. So you have, when you'll see in this in the book, I visit all these ministries, and it would drive any American bureaucrat crazy that you have the national government, you have all transportation, culture, agriculture working to do the best for tourism, and then you have the local feeding this, that, and the other, and it works. And I mentioned the city of Bordeaux as an example of how this works. It's now, as I said, the biggest industry. It's up to 10%, and one of the reasons that France is doing okay out of this recession is tourism. In fact, tourism has pulled Europe more than any other single sector right now out of the recession. And prime ministers like the one in Ireland recently thanked all the tourists. And Greece was so desperate to get some tourists that the private Greece citizen put together a little pot of money to put billboards up in New York and London inviting tourists to please come and help them out. So, the other side of tourism is that country he mentioned, Cambodia. Cambodia did the flip side of being very greedy and sort of using their country as a commodity rather than as an attractive place for others. Cambodia has, of course, Angkor Wat, the most beautiful religious buildings in the world, possibly. They have the wonderful beaches. They have a great, thriving culture. And they, at first, had a decent minister of tourism who slowly wanted to build it up, bottom up, thinking of the citizens. That changed, and they committed just about every sin you could think of. They invite hordes in without having the right infrastructure to take care of them. They have allowed the dark side of the industry, such as the sex tourism, to be huge. They have, in fact, they have pioneered in dark tourism, which is genocide tourism, where you work with other countries afflicted by genocide so that you can buy an airplane ticket from World War II Holocaust to Rwanda to Cambodia. And the money generally has not gone to the people. It's gone to foreign, which is one of the big problems with tourism. It goes to international or local elites, but not to the locals. Tourism can be one of the worst paying industries in the world. Then on the consumer side, I talk about the cruise ships. How many people here have been on a cruise? I was surprised. I had, a long time ago, I'd taken the Queen Elizabeth II, and those are my memories, nice, simple. The cruise industry now is completely changed. It's considered one of the most polluting, I call it sort of fast food tourism, a polluting, poorly paying industry where you will be going, for instance, on a cruise of 5 days, and you'll have maybe 10 hours visiting a foreign port with not much to see. It's an industry that is the least regulated because it's American-based. The majority, the two biggest ones that make up 2/3 of the industry are Royal Caribbean and Carnival, headquartered in Miami. But because of legislation, and they are able to register their ships and their companies overseas, and thereby avoiding the kind of environmental and labor standards that Americans, hotels, and other ships would have to do. And so I compare and contrast these. There's good ways to have tourism and not so good ways. On the culture side, I talked about Bordeaux as being a good example of a city in France bottom up rebuilt itself for tourism, and it's now it reflects its 19th century glory, but with modern 21st century transportation. The opposite of that is the city of Venice. Now, I'm sure a large number of you have been to Venice, but Venice now is a city of 59,000 people, and they welcome 24 million visitors every year. 24 million. That means that rents are up, prices are up, the locals are forced out. They're losing their grocery stores, their butchery stores, their bakeries, their schools, their clinics. The reason is very simple. Laws are not enforced. So I know my children love Airbnb, but Venice is what happens if a whole city is taken over by Airbnb, where your residential area, all of a sudden, it's being rented out to foreigners, and you have a souvenir shop with phony Venetian masks made in China instead of your pharmacy. So while I was there, they had protests. They've tried to appeal to the UN. The UN has said that the biggest problem facing Venice isn't rising waters, aqua alta, but it's tourism. Nothing's been done so far. Happier news: Costa Rica is rightfully considered the pioneer of ecotourism, and that's a country that you'd think was at the bottom of the heap when it came to natural resources. The Spanish sort of looked over it and said, even though they called it Costa Rica, they said, there's nothing much here. And they had their plantations and their gold elsewhere. Well, that turned out to be good for Costa Rica because they're a biological superpower now with species of birds and plants and so on and so forth that don't exist elsewhere. And they monetized, they figured out how to use this wildlife for tourism. So it's a renewable resource, so to speak, and they're a rather successful middle-class nation in the middle of Central America. Africa was another example of the nature that's working, in the sense that originally the wildlife parks of Africa, which were more or less modeled a bit on ours, which is our greatest resource, they were viewed as part of the colonial legacy. It wasn't part of Africa. It wasn't working out, and diminishing wildlife herds and so on and so forth. But now there's been, in many countries, and I mentioned Zambia where I went, there's been a resurgence, and one of the ways that it's been the resurgence has been built on that old, getting the locals involved, making them have a share in it. And I must say that was the biggest surprise to me, is how gorgeous that is. And if you have not been to Africa, go before it disappears. But in all of this, the reason I was to show that the industry, you have to see this as an industry. It's not a pastime. It's not a hobby. That you have to look at tourism the way you look at the oil industry. That when you invite tourism in, you have to regulate it. You have to decide, how is this going to affect your local community? How is this going to affect your economy? Because if you don't, you're going to end up with a Cambodia instead of a Costa Rica. And this really came to the fore in China. And the last part of the book is China and the United States, the two giants. China, unbeknownst to me, again, who knew? Deng Xiaoping gave 5 talks on tourism that I'd never heard of until I had to look at this stuff up. 5 talks, right in 1979 and 1980. And he mentioned tourism was going to change the reputation of China. We'll get these foreigners in, show them how cool we are, and they won't think of us as the red hordes anymore. And Brad mentioned my interviewing tour guides. I did, because they go through the tests and they have this spiel, and it works. Their public diplomacy through tourism is extraordinary. Couldn't believe it. And he also said, through tourism, he was going to accomplish, besides making money, which is the number one goal of this, he was also going to convince the world that Tibet was part of China. And you laugh, but he gets tourists in there, and it is much more integrated. You have the train, and it's been used. It's not over, but it certainly has been used. So um, the industry can be used to that advantage. Finally, and lastly, the United States. And it's the exception in so many ways, and particularly here because, as I said, we Americans in particular have a hard time wrapping our heads around travel and tourism as an industry because we are genetically, politically, historically opposed to that idea. And one of the reasons, again, reflecting what we're living through today, is partisan politics. About 1994, 1995, the Democrats and the Republicans went like this over tourism. Again, I wasn't paying attention. But remember Newt Gingrich's contract with America? Well, you probably didn't notice that one item was saying, get the government out of tourism. That was there. And then at the same time, President Clinton and Vice President Gore said, government in tourism. Tourism is going to be the 21st century leading industry, so let's have the first White House conference on tourism and make that one of our signature policies, because it's going to be using the internet, it's going to be clean, and we're going to show off how wonderful America is. Well, they had the conference, but it turned out to be the last conference, and the Republicans under Newt Gingrich zeroed out the major agency within the Commerce Department, and that's the end of the story. The United States pulled out of the United Nations World Tourism Organization. I think the United States and a very small country, I can't remember its name, is the only ones who are not members of it, and we're totally out of it. It became an ideological battle that remains to this day. Then with 9/11, that sort of put the icing on the cake, because with 9/11, our border policies and changing our border policies and visa policies flatlined tourism here in the United States. Now, if people who don't like a lot of tourists, they say, what's wrong with that? Well, the tourists who came during that decade were as likely to be day trippers from Canada and Mexico as any place else, and the tourists that you would want to come and visit, the wealthier tourists, didn't, because they were tired of being humiliated and pushed away at the border. And that reputation remains pretty much to this day. The industry, the American industry, put out a big report called The Lost Decade, guessing that maybe $400 billion were lost because of this. And does the United States want to remain Fortress America? It seems from my research a big change in this attitude came about after the election of President Obama, and his first trip to Europe, which you've been reading in the paper, was much more brilliant than the one he had just had now, and where he was trying to sell his hometown Chicago as the site of the U.S. Olympics in the summertime, and 2016, and it looked like a shoo-in to him. He and his wife Michelle Obama were treated wonderfully in Copenhagen. Then they went in to talk to the Olympics committee itself, and were told, we can't risk having people turned away at your border. Your reputation is really, really not good, and your actions. So we lost that, and that sort of clicked in the president's mind, and after that he started changing, and now we're having a new look at borders and visas, opening consulates, and opening up the idea that we want to have an industry that's better regulated and makes more sense. But anyway, as a sum total, this is an industry we have to watch. We are all traveling more, and this is not an innocent pastime. It is changing the way we live culturally, economically, socially, and so there's ways to do it better, and there's also essentially a role for government that I think we ignore at our peril.
My sister Julie lives in Juneau, Alaska, and she's been there for quite a long time. And they have a definite tourist industry there. They have space in the docks for 3 cruise ships, and if number 4 and 5 come in, they have to lighter passengers in. And what's interesting is that there's a movement among some people in Juneau to build extra docks for Panamax cruise ships, which I would presume would be very large. And the town of Juneau is only 30,000 people. And the locals really, some of them don't like them because they burn really smoky fuel until they get close to the dock. Then they switch to cleaner fuel. And of course, they're also dumping a lot of stuff in the water when no one's looking. I was just, maybe this is a question that's hard to answer, but I was just wondering how long it's before we get cruise ships going through the Northwest Passage or the Northeast Passage over Russia.
Alaska, there's been a huge battle back and forth. Citizens get their referendums passed, and the governor they did have a horrible problem with waste. They finally got people to be on monitors on the ships to make sure they were using proper waste. They had one cruise ship with several thousand people using a toilet facility that was worthwhile for a dozen people. It was just, the pollution was unbelievable. And I have very vivid descriptions of all this in the book. That would work. Then the industry would lobby the state legislature, the governor would respond, then they have to, it's a constant cycle, but overall, EPA has changed the rules on that crummy fuel you were talking about. So they can't use that. And a lot of cities, such as Vancouver, British Columbia, require that when you dock, you have to use electric plug-in. They won't even let you use the other kinds of fuel. So it's a back and forth. California has now passed the strictest rules about dumping in the water and air pollution. So that the cruise industry, as I said, was sort of the fast food, and they're the ones they're the biggest campaigns to improve. If the one thing the Venetians think that they have won is to be able to get the cruise ships, prevent them from docking possibly next year. In terms of the fragile Arctic and Antarctic regions, the governments that govern Antarctic recently stopped those size ships from even coming into the region, because if there's one accident, it's too fragile, it's all gone. So the restrictions are piling up. But just as one restriction starts, Norway has its particular restrictions, but as one restriction comes, something else happens. So that is a real battleground on how you save those regions, because, unintentional spills can ruin everything.
Yeah, you were, of course, an experienced world traveler before you embarked on this research in this book. But how has your own travel planning and approach to figuring out, where you're going to take a vacation, how's all that been affected by the book?
My first reaction is I didn't want to go back to places I loved because of the destruction of so many of them. I haven't gone back to the Taj Mahal. I used to live around there, and I can't go back. But overall, I'd say I tend to go where I know people, and then I can avoid it. But I tend to. I'm suspicious of these Airbnb things now that I wouldn't have been before. I go off season, not on season, and avoid cruise ships, except for I'm just so much more environmentally attuned, and I think I would more likely than not rent a house through something like National Trust of Great Britain, but I'm just much more conscientious of it. And there are great websites out there. To people who have great websites, they're sitting in these front seats here. Crest and National Geographic, the responsible tourism. You have to get to know those to avoid the and just realize there are more scams out there than you realize. You can get scammed really easily. It's a huge, huge industry with things.
Yeah. I must say I find this talk quite interesting too. I come from a small Caribbean island. I was born in Aruba, but I grew up in St. Martin. And I grew up in St. Martin exactly during the time that tourism exploded, with all of the catastrophic consequences, with all of the really catastrophic consequences. I mean, what I'm saying here would be extremely, I mean, I hope this is never shown in St. Martin because I might never get to go back, honestly. Because, no, I mean, the people absolutely hate me, and they will say, I mean, have you lost your mind since you went to the north or something like that? But I was once at the Schoenberg Center, study of black culture and stuff like that, and a set of Caribbean intellectuals were up on the stage, and an old lady walked up and she says, "So, can you tell me what is good about tourism?" And the interesting thing was these guys started to look at each other. They scratched themselves. They couldn't figure it out. I mean, I must say I'm very much in that thing. The catastrophic social consequences, the horrific breakup of families, the bringing in of, I mean, I don't want to say that because I'm in the north here, but all of the most sewer western northern issues. Because what comes in there is people go there to have fun, right? I mean, that's what you go there. You go there to relax, to come. And people who do not know that when they don't see the people come back here and live their normal life, right? They see people partying, drinking, drugging, prostitution, gambling, I mean, every type of aspect. But this, what I call, I once wrote a paper about this partying culture starts to take over the local culture, right? And then you have a corrupt class of people, they destroy. I mean, in St. Martin now, if basically the tourists don't show up, basically people have to eat one another. They have no background anymore in agriculture. They don't do anything. It's a total prepackaged industry that you have. And I thought that what was most powerful, what you said, is that there's been some research done in the Caribbean, in places like St. Martin. Out of $1 spent there or euro spent there, how much money stays on the island? People don't think more than 3-4 cents, right?
No.
I mean, the whole struggle is for 2-3 cents, right?
Right.
Because they have done nothing to use the industry as a locomotive to pull the rest of things in. So, I don't know, because you mostly talk about Europe, I don't know, you didn't even talk about one of the Caribbean islands, so I don't know if because, but this is an issue that is also hugely problematical in our cultures and societies, and I think it's been more destructive than helpful.
Thank you. Yes, I do talk about that in the book, and you're right. Not only the local farmers, but the local business, so that if do you have a Diamonds International shop in your, I mean, they're different, yes. But the shops you shop at aren't local shops. They're part of the chains that go with the trip, so that, and it is, you're lucky to get 5 cents on a dollar. It's money in, money out. And everything is sold on the cruise ships, so that they buy the excursions, and yes, and I talk at length and what it's doing to the Caribbean cultures, and the impression of what a tourist is. I quote an anthropologist covering the effect of tourism in Africa, and she has these young kids saying they want to grow up and be a tourist because all you do is sit around and eat all day, and so is that who we are? Thank you very much for that comment. And he's not a ringer. I did not ask him to come here and say that.
One of the things that interests me is perhaps a subtext in the book. But I think I wanted to take the opportunity to ask you, because I think you have a particular background that could provide some insight on this. You bring forward a number of examples of countries that came out of conflict.
Right.
Cambodia, Rwanda. And we can talk about Sri Lanka. Many people may not be aware that in Iraq, the number 2 industry is tourism. Right. And there really is a very interesting, I think, dynamic that would be very unexpected to people about the nature of tourism in terms of resilience from conflict. Could you talk, you don't bring that forward a lot in your book, but could you talk a little bit about your experience and point of view on that?
No, thank you. Isabel is with the stunning, she is the entire travel and tourism in the Commerce Department. It's interesting, tourism still continues in Afghanistan. I mentioned this in Cambodia, and I do a lot more of it in Sri Lanka. As soon as the war is over, there's that brief moment that it's in all studies about post-war periods. You have that short window of opportunity, and when always they say, let's use tourism not only to bring in money, because we don't have to build a factory and we don't have to dig down to get oil, but to bring the people together. And so there's this wonderful idealism, and it works at first. And I use Sri Lanka because there was a strong movement within the tourism ministry that you could bring the Tamils together with the Sinhalese. Politics often overrules this, but there are some examples, and it's that period when that wonderful period, that short open window, a post-war period, where tourism has been used, sometimes long-term, but more often than not short-term, because it is potentially the best diplomacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say that for a number of us who are in the tourism business, it's this aspect of tourism that we find, I think, particularly compelling.
Yes.
Which is, not only does it help us to preserve our sense of place, our culture, our foodways, and things that make us unique, but it also brings us together in the sense that governments may disagree, but when people understand one another's culture and have the opportunity to visit in the positive ways that you define, we tend to believe that it is a tremendous contributor indirectly to that as well.
Right,
So
and
thank you for your book.
Yeah, thank you. And State Department did ask me to come and talk about it. And by the end of the question period, we were discussing visa policies and Homeland Security. And
Welcome to my world.
Well, does the TSA really have to ask all those questions? And is this why people travel, to be harassed at the border? But thank you, Isabel, and thank you for your work. Well.